Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Issues Forum online teachers workshop. Today, I'm so happy to introduce Mr. Jean duPreez, who is going to give lectures on CTBT. So let me introduce Mr. Jean duPreez. Jean duPreez has 30 years experience in international diplomacy, international and regional security, arms control, and non-proliferation. After a long diplomatic career in the South African Foreign Service, he spent 7 years as a senior researcher and professor at the James Madison Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Montreal, before joining the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, CTBTO, in Vienna, where he led the External Relations and International Cooperation section from 2009 to August 2016. He is currently an independent consultant specializing in public diplomacy, arms control, and security issues, in particular, multilateral non-proliferation, counter-non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. Mr. duPreez participated in negotiations on several non-proliferation, disarmament, and arms control agreements, in particular in the context of multilateral conferences and meetings, such as Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences and their preparatory committee meetings, the General Assembly First Committee on Disarmament, the 2001 UN Conference on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its preparatory meetings, the UN Expert Panel on Missile, meetings of the Missile Technology Control Regime, and Conference of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. As a member of South African delegations to the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference and the 2000 Review Conference, he was directly involved in shaping important documents and decisions that contributed to the successful conclusion of both conferences. He also served on the South African Council for the Non-Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction, the South African National Authority for implementing the country's international non-proliferation obligations. He has authored and published numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, conference papers, and web-based reports related to non-proliferation and arms control, in particular on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a future fissile material treaty, Iran, North Korea, South Africa, etc. So today we are so fortunate to have such experienced expert for this year's CIF Teachers Workshop. So thank you very much, John, for joining the CIF workshop. And I should say, welcome back to the CIF workshop. So now I'm going to give you a microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masako, and good day to everyone out there. I'm very pleased to be back at Monterey and participate again in the Critical Issues Forum. Permit me to first and foremost thank Masako Toki for inviting me and for the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for enabling this very important program. At the outset, I also would like to recognize the fantastic work that my colleagues, former colleagues at the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is doing and continue to do to promote this treaty towards entry into force and beyond. And I will, during the talk, focus on a number of issues that the organization are dealing with. So to give an overview of what we will be discussing today, I have broken down the lecture in 5 different parts, and at each part I will stop and there will be time for questions that I believe can be posted online. First, we will talk about the history of nuclear testing and the arms race. Then we will look into the negotiating history of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the creation of the organization that implements the treaty. Thirdly, we'll focus on the technical dimensions of the CTBT, and those are the International Monitoring System, the International Data Center, and the on-site inspections. Fourthly, we will concentrate on the role that the CTBT plays in the nuclear non-proliferation disarmament regime, identify some current challenges and future prospects. And finally, I have included a segment on educational resources to train the next generation of CTBT experts. I should also emphasize that many of the slides that I'm using are sourced from the CTBTO, and I would like to acknowledge the work and creativity in developing these slides. As we all know, the nuclear age started on 16th of July 1945 with the first nuclear test, the so-called Trinity test that was conducted in New Mexico at the Nevada test site. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was in charge of the technical part of the Manhattan Project, recalled a scripture from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, and it said that if the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. These words have been echoing around the world since then, and I'm sure you would recognize that fireball as death of destroyer of the world. If you click on the YouTube link below, you can actually see a very short interview with Dr. Oppenheimer, in which he gets quite emotional about his experience. He later on became quite an advocate for not using nuclear weapons, which obviously fell on deaf ears. In the top right-hand corner, you will see the device, the Trinity device. It doesn't look anything like a nuclear bomb. It cannot be delivered. It was put on a tower about 40 feet above the ground, and it was exploded from there. The reason why I'm showing this is you will see later on what real nuclear weapons look like. And that's the reason why nuclear weapons are being tested, to get from a device of that monstrous size to something very small that can actually be fired off a missile, off a cannon, or even a bazooka. The bottom right-hand corner is, in fact, split seconds after the detonation occurred, the image, and you can almost, it looks almost like a jellyfish. It's kind of pretty, but do not mistake it. The destructive power in that was equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. We also know that soon afterwards, in fact, a little less than a month later, the United States dropped 2 weapons over the skies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On 6th of August 1945, the first nuclear weapon used in war was dropped over Hiroshima. It was colloquially called Little Boy. There was nothing little about it. It had a detonation power of about 16 kilotons, and it instantly killed 118,000 people, wounded another 80,000, and many, many more died and continue to die as a result of the radiation, the firestorms, and also the resulted heat and other related diseases. 3 days later, another bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The difference between these 2 weapons I'll show shortly. The first one is a very basic nuclear weapon design based on HEU, and the second one is a plutonium-based design, but also very basic. Nagasaki, while you may think that it killed fewer people simply because of the layout of the city being wedged in between some mountains, and therefore the bomb blast was contained to some extent. But do not be mistaken, it devastated the city and killed thousands upon thousands of people, and continued to result in the deaths of many of the elderly people, and also this formation of children. Just to give you an indication of the destructive power of a nuclear weapon, bear in mind this was a 13 kiloton bomb, 13,000 tons of TNT, the first weapon ever used. So this weapon, compared to today's weapons, is very small. So if you look at the map in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that the heat in the center part of Hiroshima was 6,000 degrees Celsius. That resulted in 86% of the people killed in the center of the city. You can read for yourself how the second and third degree burns extended to even 3 kilometers outside of the center. If that was not enough, the wind, the pressure that came as a result of this explosion destroyed everything else. So this was 50 psi. So that's a technical term for pounds per square inch. So 50 psi is enough to blow apart concrete buildings. As you may recall, towns in Japan at that time were mainly built from wood. So everything was swept away for almost a kilometer away. And then furthermore, the rain that was a result of the cloud that formed above the city contained radioactive particles. And that's what really killed people in later years. So after the first test, followed shortly after by the use of 2 nuclear weapons, the nuclear arms race started. The United States tested 2 more weapons, and I'll talk about those in a second. But the Soviet Union detonated its first weapon in 1949, despite expectations by the United States that it was not able to do so. That was followed very quickly by the United Kingdom with a 25 kiloton weapon. Then the United States in 1952 really initiated what is more the father of the modern nuclear weapons. This is an implosion type device in the megaton range. This is 10 megatons, 10 million tons of TNT that was detonated in 1952. The French joined in 1960 by using northern Algeria as their test range, resulting in the deaths and mutilation of many of the Algerian people. And the Soviet Union in 1961 conducted the largest nuclear test ever, 50 megatons, 50 million tons of TNT. You also see the smallest nuclear weapon ever designed, luckily never used in anger, but it was called Litterfella or Davy Crockett. It had a explosive power of 0.01 or 0.02 kilotons, and it could be fitted in front of a bazooka fired by a single soldier. The range of that weapon was about a mile. The nuclear fallout was more than a mile. So one can imagine what the poor soldier must have gone through after firing this weapon. China joined the club, again, against expectations, since China was considered not developed enough at that time by the other nuclear-powered states in 1964 by testing above ground at Lop Nor. In 1974, India tested this so-called Smiling Buddha test, quite a sizable test, 12 kilotons. And while India claimed that this was a peaceful nuclear explosion, something that I'll explain a bit later, this was the real entry of India into the nuclear club. Of course, we know that Pakistan later on joined in 1998, and we also had recent tests in the last 10 years by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, something that we'll discuss later on. This map or chart shows the nuclear testing over time, from the very first one in 1945 to the very latest one in September of 2016 by North Korea. You will notice on the left-hand side, the different countries that have tested in the corresponding colors are marked on the chart. So you can clearly see that most of the tests were conducted by the United States and by the then Soviet Union. Another characteristic of the chart is that you will see a gap in 1958 to early 1960. And that was when the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, the only three capable states at that time, agreed to put a moratorium on their testing while trying to negotiate a comprehensive test ban treaty. That failed, and you will see what resulted afterwards. There were more tests that were conducted in 1962 than in the 18 previous years put together. Another feature of this chart is that you will notice that in 1996, there was a drastic drop in testing. And from there on, with the exception of three countries, India and Pakistan in 98, and North Korea in 2006, 2009, 2013, and twice in 2016, all the other countries stopped testing. The reason is that's when this comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty was signed and we started to implement it. If you want to see more about nuclear testing, I encourage you to visit the CTPTO website that provides you with a very interesting list of some of the major tests with some significant pictures and graphs that you will find interesting and also useful in teaching courses that focus on the CTPT. Here's a scale comparison just as for interest's sake. On the left is Hiroshima at 13 kilotons, a very small dot on the chart. The largest weapon that the United States ever tested was the B-83 bomb. It was a bomb that was in the arsenal of the United States at 1,200 kilotons. Then the Chinese warhead at 4.5 megatons, and then the Soviet Tsar bomber that you can't even properly see on the chart. It is so large in comparison to the Hiroshima bomb. This chart also shows the magnitude of the test up until from 45 to the time when the nuclear test ban treaty was signed. So you see that China tested about 45, United Kingdom the same, France significantly more, but most tests were conducted by the Soviet Union and the United States. This combined test meant that there was one test every 9 days for those 50 years. Now you can imagine what it was like living in those times. And that's why the CTBT contributes not only to non-proliferation and disarmament, but to international peace and security. Because in those days, you did not feel safe while tests were exploding every 9 days. What I'm about to show you is a piece of art produced by a Japanese electronic artist, Isawa Hishimoto. And he showed on a world map every test nuclear explosion that occurred from 1945 to 1998. I encourage you to look at this, and if you use this for your students, I would suggest that you turn the lights off in your room and ask the students to look at this and think what it was like living in a world where these nuclear explosions go off. So each of the lights corresponding to the colors of the countries depict one nuclear explosion. You'll see in the top the countries with the flags are noted by the flags and the number of nuclear tests that they've conducted. In the bottom right are the total tests conducted. Before we start, I'll show you a short clip just to give you an indication of how it all started, and then we'll look at a time when it stopped for a little bit. Now remember, the first noise you'll hear is the very first nuclear explosion ever, followed by two, and you'll notice where they are. And I leave it to you to decide what happened. course, that was the first nuclear test conducted, and the other two in Japan were the two weapons dropped by the United States. What I'll show you now, it's about a minute long, is a clip of this artwork that starts in 1958, and it runs until about 1962. And you will see the lights flash, and then you'll find a period of quietness. There'll be 4 tests by France, but it was still relatively quiet. And then you will notice what happens after that. What you've just witnessed was an attempt by the Soviet Union and the United States to negotiate a treaty in Geneva to ban all testing. It was driven in part by the fear that the use of nuclear weapons could be imminent. It was also driven by the environmental and health lobbies, because most of these tests were conducted above ground. As we will show later on, these had devastating consequences to the people of the countries that were conducting these tests. What happened, however, after the silence broke, is that these moratoria that were unilaterally signed by the heads of state of those countries failed. And without a legally binding instruments, these countries went back and in fact increased their testing. You'll recall I mentioned the largest weapon ever tested by the Soviet Union, the so-called Tsar bomb, was one of the first weapons tested after the end of that moratorium. The lesson about this is that you cannot rely on moratoria, that we are relying at the moment to prevent testing from ever happening again. This is a slide showing the various sites where nuclear explosions occurred. You'll see most of the United States tests were conducted within the area of the United States, although some were conducted in the South Pacific and even in the South Atlantic. The Soviet Union used, first and foremost, primarily the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, and also Novaya Zemlya, which is an island in the northern part of current Russia. Britain used the territory of Australia as well as the Pacific. France used the territory of what is now Algeria as well as the Pacific. China tested on its own territory, and India, so did India and Pakistan and North Korea as well. Testing occurs in a variety of environments. First of all, testing above ground. The first test was conducted above ground. It was placed on a tower. Then they went underground. They drilled deep holes, tunnels, placed the devices in there. Tests were also conducted in the atmosphere, and we'll talk about that, as well as underwater. So between the period of the 1950s and early 60s, most of the tests were above ground. Some were also underwater and in the atmosphere. You can see the numbers are quite staggering. 96 tests by the United States and 79 tests by the Soviet Union in 1962 alone. They were also testing in the atmosphere. This is an atmospheric test by the French in the South Pacific. And of course, all that atomic and nuclear fallout went into the atmosphere and not only came down in the surrounding areas, but also was blown by atmospheric winds around the world. I believe that you've already had lectures on the design of nuclear weapons. Just to have a recap, the very basic weapon, a gun type of assembly, means that you take a piece of chemical explosive, and this is fired in a subcritical piece of uranium-238, highly enriched uranium. That causes the atomic reaction that releases the energy. The implosion method is far more complex, where you have plutonium, which is, as you are aware, a man-made product that is compressed as a result of high explosive lenses. These are shaped charges with high explosives, and that causes the nuclear explosion. And the first type was used in Hiroshima and the second in Nagasaki. You do not need to test an HEU device because it's very simple, and so Hiroshima was never, the little boy device was never tested. So the first device that was tested in Nagasaki, used in Nagasaki, was in fact tested in July of 16th, 1945, the Trinity test. But from those very basic designs, they went smaller. Again, we're looking at the little fella, very small bazooka type, to the very largest weapon ever made, the Tsar bomb, and to the modern day warheads that are multi-stage warheads that have both HEU and tritium and plutonium that's used to enhance the nuclear explosion. This is a picture on the left of a United States warhead, and although they do not exist anymore, these warheads were MIRV. They are multi-entry re-entry vehicles, meaning that you can put up to 6 warheads in one missile, each of them designed to target a different location. And to enable these kind of advanced and smaller weapon system, countries have to test, hence the need for nuclear testing. Here again, you see a couple of examples of different kinds of weapons. You've already seen the Trinity device, you've seen the Tsar bomb in the top. On the bottom left is the Trident missile in a silo, and then also you see the one fired from a submarine. This means that the warhead must be extremely stable to be launched with such force with these missiles. And for that reason, they need to be tested, including live testing. The United States also tested, in fact, a missile that flew over 1,500 miles before it detonated in the atmosphere. Briefly look at why tests occur. States need to test, obviously, the weapon's effect. And here you can see how a structure is demolished by, and this is a relatively small in 20 kiloton test. So you see the blast effect would destroy the structure. The second and third US nuclear test in 1946 was designed to test the weapon effect. The Able test is the one on the right, was 23 kilotons. It was dropped by a plane, a B-29 bomber, and it detonated above some old naval vessels. A month later, the Baker test was the first underwater test. It was sizable, 23 kilotons, and the idea was to see if a whole fleet could be destroyed. This was the same design as the weapon used to destroy Nagasaki, Fat Man. And you see the blast in the bottom. This was done in the Bikini Atoll, and up until today, most of the Bikini Atoll is inhabitable. Very interesting is to celebrate the Baker test. Admiral Blanding, who was in charge of the fleet, celebrated this nuclear test with a party cake. People had completely different ideas about nuclear testing in those days than they have today. Also, to test the use of a nuclear device as a weapon, A test was conducted in 1957 called Plum Bob or Stokes. And this was to test the battlefield capability of a nuclear weapon. What you see in the front of the picture are not dummies, these are real soldiers. The test is far away, so they were not directly impacted, although reports indicate that many of them in later years suffered from cancer. Tests are also used to test the safety of weapons. So whether the high explosives in the weapon is initiated, whether it can withstand severe shocks, even accidents. A number of nuclear weapons over the years have either been dropped accidentally or the planes that carried them crashed. And those weapons did not detonate because of these kind of safety tests. Again, on the top, you'll notice people standing relatively close to a nuclear test, obviously not concerned about their own safety. And as far as weapons development, this is to test the performance, the designs, the physics, how the physics work to develop more advanced designs, and how to make weapons smaller, more robust, and with a higher yield. So a good example of a performance test was the Ivy Mike test of 1951, which was the first performance test of a true two-stage thermonuclear device. And so from that first test, the modern nuclear weapons of the United States were developed and tested over time to where they are now, and no longer needed to be tested, but are still in the arsenal of the United States and also the other states with nuclear weapons. Another interesting one is the first test of a ballistic missile with a live nuclear warhead. It was delivered over a range of 1,174 miles, and it was quite a large device, as you can notice. The physics, whether the fusion physics and the radiation flow all work. The physics test of the Soviet Union detonated a one-stage design. It was a rather crude weapon, but resulted in greater understanding by the Soviets about how these multi-stage weapons work. Very important, nuclear weapons also have political motivations. Testing was used to send messages. Professor Scott Sagan from Stanford developed 3 basic motives for developing nuclear weapons. First is security, the other one norms, international norms that prevent you from acquiring weapons, but also domestic politics, whether a country feels that it's domestically, a government will be in better power if it has nuclear weapons. Whatever the reason or combination of reasons motivates a state to proliferate, testing would always further its goals. And very often the technical and political reasons coexist. So testing obviously served to deter, because it shows that a country has a nuclear capability and therefore is aimed to deter countries from attacking it. Also to change the status quo, so as to compel another state that it acquires a greater force. This could be very well the situation between India and Pakistan. Requires a credible nuclear threat, could apply in very much to the case of North Korea. Again, also in the case of China, even France, India, and Pakistan. One counterexample in this case is Israel, that has never declared itself as nuclear capable, nor denied it, but has also not had any known nuclear tests. The reason for that is that Israel either acquired the technology or are satisfied that their nuclear arsenal, while may not be as advanced as others, sufficiently serves a sufficient deterrent. Some domestic political motivations are also important, especially when you have internal politics. This is the case very much in India and Pakistan, where there's a certain amount of pride in nuclear weapons development. And of course, the leading party would take credit for that. There's an anomaly in nuclear testing. There was a concept called peaceful nuclear explosions, or P&Es. These is actually, if you read about them, you may think you're reading science fiction, but there were quite a number of P&Es tested. About 150 of the total number of nuclear tests that are 2,057 over time were peaceful nuclear explosions. So what's a peaceful nuclear explosion? In Article 5 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it actually makes provision that those countries that are capable of having nuclear weapons, and those are defined in that treaty, must share with other countries that do not have nuclear weapons the advantages of using a peaceful nuclear explosion. Luckily, these so-called peaceful explosions are prohibited under the CTBT since it bans all kinds of nuclear tests. So the first P&E was in 1961 in the United States, followed by the Soviets. It was designed to excavate large quantities of earth and also to store gas in large quantities, to put out oil fires, to do seismic soundings, etc., etc. So a few examples of these. Firstly, the Sedan test. This is an interesting case. This was a nuclear test in Nevada, in the former US test site. It had an explosive power of 104 kilotons, about 8 times the size of Hiroshima. It displaced 12 million tons of soil and created a crater 100 meters deep and about 400 meters wide. It's the largest man-made crater in the United States. However, as a result of the test that was semi-above ground, so all the nuclear particles escaped, about almost 1 million curies of iodine fall out over Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Illinois. This was the second most fallout-intensive nuclear test of all US continental tests. The Soviets didn't want to be outdone, and they decided they want to create an artificial lake in Kazakhstan. This is at Chagan, which is on the edge of the Semilipalatins test site, the former Soviet test site in Kazakhstan. It was one of the largest explosions conducted on ground by the Soviet Union, 140 kilotons. It created a lake about 400 meters across and 100 meters deep. And a canal was dug out to enable the river close by to fill up the lake. The reservoir still exists today, and the water continues to be radioactive. And this radioactivity has impacted hundreds and hundreds of people's lives in Kazakhstan. Some other very interesting, far-fetched ideas, but that were really planned. One was the Panatomic Canal, believe it or not. The scientists and the US nuclear labs thought it would be a good idea to dig another Panama Canal using nuclear devices to blow the canal between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Luckily, common sense prevailed. They also thought of creating a deep sea harbor on the Alaskan coast. It was Project Chariot. They wanted to detonate several hydrogen bombs to create a harbor at Cape Thompson. This was never carried out due to the concerns of the native population, who were particularly concerned about how this will impact on the fishing. This is a slide just to show the variety of tests conducted by particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. I also want to just refer to other alternatives, because this is an issue that always comes up. So the first thing that we have to understand is that nuclear test emits a yield, a nuclear amount of nuclear power. So alternatives to full-scale testing are a variety of these. The most notable ones I want to briefly discuss. One is a hydronuclear test, where nuclear materials are under the conditions of explosive shock compression, and they study how this would react. Then you get subcritical or cold tests. These are types of tests involving nuclear materials and possibly high explosives that purposefully result in no yield. And finally, the so-called computer simulations, where very large, very powerful nuclear supercomputers are used to test the integrated design codes and other elements of a nuclear device. So as you can see on the right is a subcritical experiment. This is not a nuclear test. In fact, these tests or experiments are used to underpin the stockpile stewardship program of the United States and similar programs in other countries with nuclear weapons. They are not considered to be nuclear explosive tests and are not covered by the CTBT. The consequences of nuclear testing have been severe over the years. So I just want to highlight a few. Again, the Tsar bomb, the largest bomb ever constructed by the Soviet Union. This thing was so large that the plume that you see there went 60 kilometers into the sky. The shock wave went several times around the world. The Tu-95 bomber that dropped it had to be specially modified. They gave the pilot about a 50% chance of survival. He did survive, but the plane, after it dropped the bomb, lost about 1 kilometer in altitude, and because of the shock wave. While the weapon was detonated above the ground at about 4 kilometers, it still created a 5.0 on the Richter scale seismic event. On the right, Bainbury was supposed to be an underground test, but it vented. That means that it released, as you can see, a lot of material. It was observed as far away as Las Vegas, which is 120 kilometers away from the test site. It pumped about 80,000 curies of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere, and the wind carried it over several states, resulting in cancerous diseases. Starfish Prime is another interesting one, where the United States tested a device in the atmosphere, 400 kilometers above the Johnson Atoll in the northern Pacific Ocean. It had an explosive yield of 1.5 megatons, about 100 times that of Hiroshima. This was at a time when the Cold War was at its hottest. This was following shortly after the Tsar bomb, and the idea was to experiment the impact of a nuclear explosives on the magnetosphere, also known as the Van Allen belts, and see if they could disrupt this. The only thing that they actually did was they knocked out power in a number of places, including in as far as Hawaii. So the irony is that the US tested a device, and one of its own territories, Hawaii, received a power surge that knocked out numerous devices, led to a number of other incidents as well. What happens when something goes wrong? So Castle Bravo was an interesting case. This is a famous test that was conducted in the South Pacific and the Bikini Atoll, and a very large weapon. Due to a design error, it detonated at 15 megatons, 15 million tons of TNT. You can see on the right, the island actually has a little round area. That did not used to be round, it was filled up. That's the hole that this thing made. The radioactive fallout from the test spread over more than 11,000 square kilometers, far more than what was expected, with the effect that fishermen that was fishing in the area were not aware of the test, because they were outside what was considered to be the area, the fallout area. Now, the vessel in the bottom right corner was the Lucky Dragon number 5, a Japanese fishing vessel that in 1954 was fishing in the area but outside the test zone. And unfortunately, the Lucky Dragon was not so lucky. The intensive radioactivity caused by the explosion came onto the boat while it was still 145 kilometers away, and most, if not all of its sailors later died. Also important is the so-called downwind effect. Most of the nuclear tests that were conducted by the United States, for instance, and I am only showing this of the United States, but the same occurred as particular in Kazakhstan as a result of the Soviet tests, etc. Most of the tests were conducted in Nevada. And while, of course, in that area, you can imagine that the estimation of 131 iodine was very high, it is hard to believe that some of that spread even as far as the upper northeast coast of the United States. You'll see the map of the United States in the left corner with the doses received by Americans from the Nevada test site. Operation Buster, showing in the the right bottom corner, was a 21 kiloton test conducted at the Nevada test site in November 1951 as part of Operation Buster. It was the first US nuclear field exercise conducted on land. These troops that you see were only 6 miles away from that explosion. Dr. Louise Rice conducted a very interesting, very important study in the 60s. She studied the effect of radioactive strontium on baby teeth that were born between 1945 and 1965, and discovered that it increased 100-fold. So the level of strontium-90 rose in correlation with atomic bomb test. And this showed an alarming rise in the percentage of underweight live births and childhood cancer. In fact, they believe that people that were born in that period in the United States and in the downwind states, many of them were likely to suffer some kind of cancer, particularly thyroid cancer. Finally, this chart shows an interesting measurement of iodine. What you see is the 100 line, the blue line is the natural level. You will see New Zealand, very far away from where nuclear tests were conducted, in red. And very interesting, Austria. Vormondsee, which is in the central western part of Austria, received an exceptionally high level. Austria, and there were no weapons ever conducted, tests conducted in Europe. Austria is a completely nuclear-free country, does not even have nuclear energy, yet it suffered from the consequences of these tests. Before we come to the end of this introduction on nuclear testing, this is a comical picture showing with a not so comical message. What you see here, of course, is the Neanderthals. Neanderthals lived about 24, 25 million years ago, witnessing a nuclear test down in the valley. Of course, we know that was not possible, but if you imagine that a plutonium-based nuclear weapon, the half-life of plutonium, Pu-239, is 24,100 years. That would mean that if a nuclear test was conducted in the time of the Neanderthals, that we would still suffer from the nuclear fallout. As if that is not enough, today's arsenals remain huge. While they have come down as a result of the end of the Cold War, we know that in the stockpile of particularly the United States and the Soviet Union are about 15,000 nuclear warheads. France, China, United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea also have them. And the contribution of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that we'll discuss next is aimed to bring these numbers down. So if there are any questions at this stage, I'll be willing to take them. If not, we can move on to the next part of the talk. Okay, if there are no questions, please keep your questions for later on. We can come back to any of the issues that I've discussed. What I plan to do now is go through the second part, which is the negotiating history and the creation of the CTBTO. This is not so long. And then I will talk about the technical dimensions, and then we'll take a break. So linking the history of nuclear testing to the development of the nuclear non-proliferation regime is important. This is just a timeline where you see even going back as far as Prime Minister Nehru from India, who in fact came up with the idea at the height of nuclear testing to put a hold on testing. There were several initiatives by, as I mentioned, also by the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States to negotiate a treaty. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. There was a treaty to negotiate the Partial Test Ban Treaty. The NPT was negotiated, several other treaties, until the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva finally negotiated the CTBT, and it opened for signature in 1997, and the organization was established as a result. Again, just to remind you of the number of tests occurred, and this also is important to look at some of the dates in history in terms of what happened. You know, the Berlin Wall, détente, all hidden away in the numbers. But the most important number here is 1996. Before I say that's also important to look at 1962, when most of the nuclear tests occurred in 1 year. And of course, we know those were volatile years. In the late 50s and early 60s, nuclear testing peaked. We already heard that the Soviet Union and the United States conducted combined 278 tests. That was the time when Secretary Khrushchev deployed missiles to Cuba, and was strongly, suspicions were strong that these missiles were nuclear capable. This resulted in strong tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there were, in fact, several letters exchanged between President Kennedy and Secretary Khrushchev. And in one of those, Secretary Khrushchev suggested the idea of a test ban treaty. Can you imagine? This is at the height of tensions during the Cold War, and they foresee such a letter. In fact, refer to it, it would be a great gift to mankind. As a result of superb statesmanship on both sides, a good deal of sheer luck, and the involvement of the Organization for American States and the Security Council, the issue was resolved. So you'll see these are very historic pictures. President Kennedy sitting in the White House, some of the ambassadors leading the negotiations, and Ambassador Stevenson of the United States actually showing to the Security Council the pictures taken by US spy planes about the location of these missiles. Now, of course, there was never an exchange of missiles. There was not testing, but testing occurred on the side by both countries. In fact, they were sending political messages to each other through the voice of nuclear explosions. As a result of all of this, and also following the proposal made by Prime Minister Nehru, they started negotiations of a test ban treaty, albeit a partial test ban treaty. It took only 10 days to negotiate this treaty. It banned all nuclear test explosions in the atmosphere, in outer space, underwater, but did not do so in the underground. There were also no verification measures. Each party was considered capable of doing so through its own national technical means. Very importantly also, the types of technologies that exist today did not exist back then. So there was no trust in technologies. The picture shows President Kennedy signing the treaty in October 1963. This was a memo that was sent to President Kennedy by then Secretary of Defense McNamara, who listed all the countries that they consider could be capable if there was not a test ban agreement. So another example of, even in those days, that they felt if there's a test ban, it will limit the number of countries that proliferate to nuclear weapons. You can find some very interesting countries listed there that, of course, have not acquired nuclear weapons. Some of them did. Other countries experimented with them. There are countries on there, including my own country, South Africa, that have also acquired nuclear weapons, but are not even listed. Interesting, after the test ban treaty, the tests didn't stop, they just went underground. And so we see that the majority of tests over the period of time were conducted underground. Yet the test ban treaty is still considered as one of the key treaties in the non-proliferation regime. It was in fact the first multilateral treaty that was negotiated with the idea of stemming the nuclear arms race. The CTBT was negotiated in the Conference on Disarmament as a result of an initiative by President Clinton in the General Assembly. He famously called the CTBT the longest sought and hardest fought prize in the history of arms control, and I must say those words still ring true today. The negotiations did not take place in a political vacuum. It was, of course, the end of the Cold War. There was a much can-do attitude to international threats. As we know, there were a lot of issues going on in those years, including the end of apartheid, the end of communism, etc., etc. Moratorium on nuclear tests were placed by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Those moratoria still exist. There was a group of scientific experts that were conducting experiments and research over a period of 20 years on what type of verification measures would be needed for a verifiable test ban treaty. And of course, there were new developments in science, electronic data communication, sensor technologies, especially for the sensors that we use today. Also to allowing the maintenance of nuclear arsenals without testing, the so-called stockpile stewardship. Very important to recognize is the strong influence of civil society and public opinion that basically moved the partial test ban treaty into a more comprehensive one. And another factor that's maybe not as well recognized is that following the conclusion of the Chemical Weapons Convention in the Conference on Disarmament that took many years to negotiate, the diplomats from the variety of countries in Geneva were very experienced in arms control. And so they managed to find agreements that we see today in the treaty. As in any treaty, the treaty is not perfect. There were a number of problems. There were problems on whether to allow a very low yield, whether to allow peaceful nuclear explosions, how to capture the countries that are outside the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, such as India and Pakistan. India at the end blocked final agreement. It demanded that there must be included in the treaty a time-bound framework for the global elimination of nuclear weapons. Since the entry into force requirement also include India as to ratify the treaty, India opposed that, in fact, walked away. So the treaty was never formally adopted in the Conference on Disarmament. Australia, its ambassador in Geneva, took the treaty and went to the General Assembly in New York, wrote a short resolution, attached the treaty to it. The resolution was passed with a vast majority, and the treaty was open for signature. You see President Clinton signing the treaty on the left, the Vice Premier of China and the Russian Foreign Minister, excuse me. The basic provisions of the CTBT are very simple, but difficult to implement. Article 1, not to carry out any nuclear test explosion or any other nuclear explosion, and to prevent such explosions at any place under its jurisdiction. So a country cannot allow another country to test on its area. Article 2, very important as well, is that any state must refrain from causing, encouraging other states to conduct nuclear tests, including through their nationals. The treaty also provides for the organization in Vienna. It requires states to have national legal measures in place to implement the treaty. It establishes the global verification regime that we'll come to in a minute or two. It provides for ways to ensure compliance, to settle disputes, because of course there could be disputes between whether it was a nuclear test or a other kind of explosion or an earthquake. It has a very complicated, very problematic entry into force clause that basically says that 180 days after the deposit of ratification by all the states listed in Article 44 and Annex 2, and there are 44 of them, then the treaty will enter into force. Those 44 states were chosen from a list prepared by the International Atomic Energy Agency with all the countries that had at that point nuclear reactors, of either power reactors or research reactors, and were also part of the Conference on Disarmament. And in 1996, a General Assembly resolution established the Preparatory Commission that was formally formed in 1997. Just a slide quickly summarizing what the treaty is about. And this slide is the Preparatory Commission. Now, it is legally called the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. I can tell you, after I've worked there for 7 years and I've also helped negotiate this treaty, that there's nothing preparatory about this organization. It is almost in full effect. It has shown that it is effective in detecting nuclear tests and that it contributes to the global non-proliferation regime. It is staffed by a secretariat of about 300 people, and it is also a political body with all its member states, all the signatory parties to the treaty. It has two essential jobs: is to promote the treaty and its entry into force, and to establish the verification regime. It also has sub-bodies. One is technical, one is more administrative and budgetary. The head of the organization currently is Dr. Lassina Zerro. He is a national from Burkina Faso, and he is one of the top scientists in this field. In fact, he headed up for many years the International Data Center. His predecessor was Ambassador Tibor Toth from Hungary, who also helped negotiate the treaty. He was a career diplomat, and before him, the first executive secretary came from Germany, Ambassador Hoffman, who basically helped to establish the organization. This is a map of the members of the treaty. Those countries in green are those who have signed and ratified the treaty. Those are the countries that have said we will never ever allow or test nuclear weapons. The red squares are the so-called Annex 2 states. Those are required to ratify the treaty before it can enter into force. And you'll see a number of those red squares are not green yet. Those firstly are the blue ones. So the United States, China, Egypt, Israel, Iran, then you have North Korea, India, and Pakistan. A number of other countries, of course, are not Annex 2, but they're also important to ratify the treaty. I'm very pleased that just a month or two ago, countries such as Myanmar and even a small country as Swaziland ratified the treaty, thereby signaling their strong support for this very important international norm. The entry into force clause is problematic. Again, you see the Annex II states, 8 remain before those 8 countries ratify the treaty. The treaty is basically held hostage, and it will not enter into force until they have done so. 3 of them have not yet signed the treaty: North Korea, India, Pakistan, and 5, China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and the United States, are yet to ratify. Unfortunately, they're all linked, and we will see later on how that impacts on the future of the treaty. Are there any questions at this stage before I talk about the technical elements of the treaty?
Okay, thank you, John. So I see one teacher from Japan. Jerry,
Sure.
do you want to ask a question? I temporarily unmute your audio. Do you have a question? Okay, sorry. I think it doesn't. Okay, so Jerry, if you have a question, just raise your hand or send me text. So while we are waiting, I have actually questioned for teachers who will be also watching this video. So many teachers are going to watch your lecture. So I'm going to ask some questions. So in your first lecture, okay, let me, okay, thank you. So I just wanted to ask very basic questions, and also relate. In your first lecture, you talked about history of nuclear testing, and looks like almost 2,000 nuclear testing during the Cold War and up until now. That's a huge number. And I am wondering how countries are going to notify other countries to conduct testing, because you also mentioned Lucky Dragon, which was not so lucky. And that ship was in that area, and unfortunately they were contaminated. So I understand they were also notified, but they were there, and I'm just curious how countries are going to notify the people or the neighboring countries, although they try to conduct nuclear weapon testing where no one is there, but unfortunately there are some people affected. So would you please share that kind of information?
Sure, Masako. It's a good question, especially when we consider the later impact of contamination, as we've seen, continue to see both in the United States and particularly in Kazakhstan. When countries decided to test nuclear weapons, they of course acquire specific large parts of land that are fairly far away for safety reasons, but also these are highly classified programs. And so they would either purchase up large parts of land, or this was land owned by the government. So the nuclear test site, which is now called the National Security Site in Nevada in the United States, is a very, very large piece of land owned by the federal government. And they have conducted all sorts of tests there, including long-range cannons and artillery tests, etc. So no one lives there on that land. So, but the problem is nuclear tests that we've seen, especially those that have conducted above ground, but even those underground, that some of them have, as they say, vented, they get blown to other states, thousands and thousands of miles away, even to other continents. So there's no notification of that whatsoever. In the case of the Soviet Union, they did not clear the whole of the Semipalatinsk area. There were a lot of people that stayed there, and that because these are nomadic people. They move from places to places with their horses and camels and so forth. And so they would just stumble upon that. classic case in Australia about an Aboriginal woman who was also nomadic, and she, with her child, at one particular night, decided to move across a particular large piece of country, and the nuclear test went off just before that. And she found an area that they could camp at night. She actually camped right where the test went off, and it was highly toxic. So there are many of these examples. But when, in terms of the political messaging that states send, some states would announce. North Korea is a good example. I mean, the North Koreans have announced every test that they've conducted because they want, in their view, a recognition of their power to both manage advanced technologies and to send a message to other countries, particularly the United States, that they have a nuclear weapon. The Trinity test was unannounced. It was highly classified. The Soviet test, the first one, was the same, and all the others were that. But I should also say that in all cases, with the exception of Israel, that never acknowledged a nuclear test, the countries deliberately tested to showcase that they have nuclear weapons. So while they did not notify other countries, I mean, you can speculate whether the United Kingdom and France, as allies of the United States, notified the United States that they were testing. I don't think history would agree that the Chinese notified anyone, nor the Russians. There's some indications that some of the earlier North Korean tests, the North Koreans notified Beijing. But so the basic answer to your question is no, they don't, and this has led to a lot of tragic consequences of nuclear testing. I mean, your example of the Lucky Dragon, the fishermen were notified. Had the nuclear device gone off at the magnitude that it was designed, they probably would not have been in danger. But because it went off in a much larger magnitude, they were in danger. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. So thank you very much, John. So also during the Cold War, I heard there were so many anti-nuclear testing protests among civil society, because of the environmental effect and also human impact. So, and also the negotiation started between mainly United States and the Soviet Union became so aware of the danger of arms race. But I'm also wondering, were there any other countries' condemnation or criticism against nuclear weapons testing?
Absolutely. I mean, the countries, well, firstly, I think it's important, as I mentioned very briefly, that civil society took a lead. Governments follow what the voters want to do. And so, in fact, in 1992, there were, before the United States, President Clinton issued a moratorium test, there was already a device ready to be tested. It was already delivered to the Nevada test site. Similarly, in the case of Russia, there was a device in Semipalatinsk already in its tunnel to be tested. But due to, first and foremost, domestic pressure. So here, I think one can recognize, for instance, the Physicians Against Nuclear War, who took a major initiative. There were protest marches, there were letters written, there were studies by Dr. Rice about the baby teeth. All these things contributed to the public's understanding of the danger, because you go back on, and this is interesting just for, especially I think teaching high school kids, if you look at some of the things that people thought they could do with nuclear power, nuclear-powered cars and planes and all sorts of silly things. People had these ideas. And there was even, in my preparation for, I read an interesting little thing about, you've got to show that nuclear weapons, there were 5 soldiers that were standing under a nuclear detonator. It went off above them, but they were standing under the detonation, just to show, well, this is safe, which is obviously nonsense. But the governments tried to persuade their people that there was no fear of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons while they're being developed. The contrary is obviously true. And so civil society took that step. But countries, majority of the countries do not have nuclear weapons and did not have them. These countries were affected. Algeria, for instance. Algeria was obviously an African country, was a victim of French testing. The African Organization for African Union, the forerunner of the African Union, actually adopted a resolution way back in 1961 that eventually led to the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty. And that also very clearly states that no nuclear testing will be allowed in Africa. So the whole continent came together to fight this. So the Conference on Disarmament, once it finally reached there, did not allow only the nuclear countries to negotiate this treaty. Because, in fact, between Russia and the United States, they wanted to have low yield. They wanted to allow small tests to still occur. The other countries said no. So this is a true example of multilateral diplomacy at work, where you had not only the public, but countries that are continued to be strong advocates for nuclear disarmament and arms control, putting pressure on the nuclear weapon states. And this can be done again. It's just a question, we need to find the right format.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really important information. So since we don't have a question from teacher at this moment, shall we continue?
Sure, I'll continue, and then I suggest we take a break after that.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
So the next part of the talk focuses on the technical parts of the treaty. I have often said this is a technical treaty, because it is, with a very large political problem. So let's focus on the science, because while I'm not a scientist, I have a good understanding of the science of this treaty. And I can tell you with a certain amount of conviction that this is a true example of how science contributes to international peace and security. So the elements of the regime or the system set up to verify adherence to this treaty are 4. Firstly, there is an international monitoring system that consists of 337 facilities that is linked to an international data center through a global communication infrastructure. We'll talk more about that. Then built into the treaty is a very unique formula or article that allows for consultation and clarification, where states have the right to clarify matters related to possible non-compliance. For instance, if there was a large explosion that a neighboring country considered to be a nuclear test, there must be there's a formula for consultation to show what this was in fact, that it was not, before an on-site inspection is initiated. On-site inspections are very intrusive, they are very expensive, and they also send a very strong message, because of course, if a country is considered to have conducted a nuclear explosion after on-site inspection, the consequences of that could be severe. Also built into the treaty as part of the regime is confidence building measures. For instance, large chemical explosions are used to blow deep holes for mining. My country, South Africa, is a mining country. Western Deep Mine is about 4.5 kilometers deep, and they detonate very large chemical explosions down there to break up the rock and to excavate gold and other mines, coal. This could obviously lead to misinterpretations, because these explosions signal seismic events and are picked up by the international monitoring system. So important for countries, in terms of the treaty, to notify each other if they conduct these kind of explosions. So what you see here is a nuclear test alarm system. It is called the International Monitoring System. It comprises of 337 facilities. 321 of them are stations spread out over the world, supported by 16 radionuclear laboratories. So very briefly, you find the primary seismic and auxiliary seismic stations that basically do the same thing. It's just a question that auxiliary seismic stations do not consistently send data, but they are the green and blue dots and triangles around the globe. You also find very few but very powerful hydroacoustic stations. These are the tiny yellow stars. And then infrasound stations and radionuclide stations. Infrasound are in sort of red or deep red diamonds, and radionuclides are sort of the salmon-colored squares. So of these 337 facilities, we are about 86% complete. There are still stations that need to be built in very difficult areas. Just recently, Executive Secretary Zerbo went to the Galapagos Islands, where the station is being built there. That's a very important station, especially given its locality here, right on the equator, because of the different ways that winds turn in the northern and southern hemisphere. If you want to learn more about how the system works, there's a link here that puts you into touch with the CTBTU website. So one of the first technologies is the largest number of technologies. There are 170 seismic stations spread out over the world, and they are obviously there to detect the movement underground as a result of the test. So there's a short simulation that you can watch for about 2 minutes to explain how this works.
The white dots shown here are seismic stations. The seismic network is the biggest one of the CTBT global alarm system. It consists of 170 stations. 50 stations send data continuously. Another 120 send data on request. What you see here is the inside of the Earth. The red circles are seismic waves caused by an event deep in the ground, like an earthquake. Seismic waves cause vibrations in the ground. When they arrive at a station, they are detected by its seismometers. Here you see a typical seismic station built as an array. Some arrays can consist of up to 25 seismometers. This one has 10. They are arranged in 2 concentric circles with 2 seismometers in the center. A seismometer needs to be connected to solid rock to detect seismic waves most efficiently. At this station, seismometers are deployed at the bottom of boreholes. These boreholes can be up to 100 meters deep. With an array, one can determine from where seismic waves arrive. This helps to locate an event. Seismometers arranged as an array also amplify the seismic signal against seismic background noise. One of the 2 central seismometers covers a broader frequency range. It provides information on the depth and magnitude of an event. When seismic waves hit a seismometer, the instrument transforms the vibrations into electrical signals. These signals are then sent by radio to a central recording facility. There, computers record the data and prepare them for transmission via satellite link to the CTBTO in Vienna. The entire process takes only a few seconds. Here you can see it all happening again. Seismic waves arrive at a station, are transformed into electrical signals, which are transmitted to a central recording facility, and from there, via satellite link, to the CTBTO in Vienna. There, data are processed and analyzed immediately upon arrival to clarify the nature of the recorded event.
So you've heard that the data arrives at the CTBT in Vienna. And this is what it looks like. So over the span of 16 years, since February 2000, when the first station came online, the International Data Center received from all these stations thousands upon thousands of pieces of data. Of the data received, some of the data are screened out automatically. For instance, if a seismic event that occurs 300 kilometers deep, which is obviously an earthquake, it's impossible for it to be considered as a possible nuclear event. So of those events that needed to be analyzed, firstly by the computers and secondly by human analysts, there has been more than 500,000 events. Now, from an arms control verification perspective, this is a real challenge, because if you can't even see the Korean Peninsula clearly on this map, but you need to find in there the 5 declared nuclear tests by North Korea. They are about this size, a magnitude of less than 4, maybe the last 1 or 2, 5. So that is very, very difficult. Therefore, the analysts that are employed by the CTBT in Vienna, but also trained by the national data centers that are spread out in each and every country, their task is to sift through this data and ignore all the other data and focus on the data that indicates a nuclear test. But them being scientists, they are also interested in the Earth's movement. And so what is interesting of this map is you can actually see the tectonic plates. You can see high areas of seismicity. Some areas, of course, this is not just seismicity. For instance, using my own country as an example again, these are not nuclear explosions, these are not earthquakes, they are deep mine explosions used in mining. Jokingly, I must say, this also tells you where not to go on vacation. Unfortunately, all the very nice places that people like to go, like the Pacific Rim, the west coast of North and South America, etc., are heavily impacted by seismic events. How does one distinguish between a seismic event that is typical of an explosion or one of an earthquake? Well, it's very difficult. I'm not even going to try and explain to you exactly how the analysts do this, but this 2 charts show a very simplistic way the difference. And it's not always this simplistic. I must say this very clearly. So in 2006, on October 9th, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. And what you see is an explosion-like seismic event. So what you notice on the left is a hard explosion. As Dr. Zerbo, who was then the IDC, often showed, if you slap your hand on the table and then you feel the vibrations afterwards. That is an explosion. The vibrations cause some seismic event as a result. On the right is a more earthquake-like event. So some people call this a running train. If those of you who have been witness to a large earthquake, there's a slow rumble and then it increases to the peak of the earthquake, and then the surface waves then eventually come back to normal. But that is very much a very simplistic way of looking at it. And I must emphasize this is not as easy in all cases, because of course an explosion can also set off an earthquake, and then they need to distinguish between what was in fact the earthquake and what was the explosion. By showing the 5 nuclear tests by North Korea, I also hope to show how the system works. So this is a map of the first test in 2006, and you'll see only a few stations, 22 stations picked it up. Well, the system was not as well developed. It was an extremely small test. Some believe the test was actually a failure, yet it was picked up and the location was determined, and I'll come to that. This was the 2009 test. This time 61 stations picked them up. The difference in the black squares and the squares that are not colored are the primary stations. So the primary stations collect the data first, then the analyst or the computer decides whether there was something of interest, and they go back to the auxiliary stations and they get more data. 2013, they conducted yet another test. This time, 96 stations picked it up. But it's very important to look at the distances. I mean, stations as far as Antarctica, as way north in northern Alaska, picked this up. So it's one of the stations that are very important to the CTBTO is a station in Niger. It's in a very quiet, seismic quiet area, and it has consistently picked up these stations, but the distance from there to North Korea is almost halfway around the world. 2016, January of this year, 102 stations picked up the signal, and again, the stations far away were very active. And finally, the September 2016, 108 stations. So you can see the system is working very well. And what this does, it generates a location and confidence ellipse. Now, these ellipses are designed to enable the future inspectors to define an area where they can go looking for where this test occurred. The treaty is very clear that the area must be less than 1,000 square kilometers. Now you can see here that those areas are far less. In fact, even the first test that occurred in 2006, which is the blue ellipse, that is about 880 square kilometers, and the later test were even less than 200. Now, this is superimposed on a Google Earth map, and if you zoom in closer, you can in fact right here see the tunnels of the test site. So by triangulating the variety of signals coming from all the stations, it enables the organization to find the location where the test occurred. Here's just a chart showing the comparison between the events. Again, the numbers are impressive, but this part here are very important because this shows how accurate the system is from in 2006 to 880 square kilometers where they need to go and find that test site to 153 square kilometers. The next technology is radionuclide and noble gas. So this is basically sniffing the air for any activity that is a result of a nuclear explosion. These are either radionuclide particulars that are very, very fine, that are captured by machines such as this one, or noble gas stations that detect particular noble gases. So again, we will look at the CTBTO's animation, which is very informative.
The white dots you see here are radionuclide stations. 80 such stations are part of the CTBT global alarm system to detect nuclear explosions, like this one. A nuclear explosion generates radioactive particles and gases. These radionuclides are dispersed by the winds. They may travel long distances from an explosion. Radionuclide stations are deployed to detect them. These stations are built in exposed areas as they rely on the wind. In an air sampler, radionuclide particles get trapped on a filter. Once a day, the filter is removed from the sampler and compressed. It is left untouched for 24 hours to allow non-relevant radionuclides to decay. The compressed filter is measured in a detector for another 24 hours. The result is information on the radioactive particles found on the filter. The detection of underground nuclear explosions is more challenging. Such explosions also generate radioactive particles and gases. But as you can see, the particles cannot escape from the underground. We have to rely on the radioactive noble gases as evidence. They seep through the underground into the atmosphere and are dispersed by the wind. Half of the radionuclide stations can detect such radioactive noble gases, in particular xenon. The detection process for noble gases is different. Air is collected as before, but only the gases are trapped. Xenon is then isolated and measured. Here you see everything again. Radioactive particles and gases arrive at a station. They are being sampled and measured in separate processes. Resulting data are sent via satellite link to the CTBTO in Vienna for further analysis.
You'll notice that some of these stations are in very difficult areas. Of course, they need to be in areas that are not affected by other radioactive sources, one of which of those could be the production of medical isotopes. Medical isotope production also releases xenon, and of course, the machines can get confused, so they have to calibrate the machines very carefully to filter out the background radioactivity. And one of the things that the organization utilizes is atmospheric transport modeling. These models are designed to do forward and backwards modeling based on millions and millions of pieces of data are generated from meteorological sources. What you see in the animation in front of you is the animation that was put together at the time of the first North Korean test in 2006. And it was forwardly deployed with the idea to determine which of the stations downwind will be affected, and also to determine where the source was, because there is a production facility of medical isotopes in northern Canada. And this isotope production facility could generate xenon. What this model then actually showed, the CTBTO station at Yellowknife, also in northern Canada, picked up the release, which then indicated that there was in fact a smoking gun. But it also shows that it did not come close to that Yellowknife, that medical isotope facility, which does then give confidence that it was not the xenon that came from the medical isotope, but in fact from North Korea, which is over here. So these are highly technological based data that is being generated and analyzed. Again, noble gas was detected in 2013 after the test. Very interesting, in this case, it was detected at two stations, one in Takasaki in Japan, which also became very famous as a result of the Fukushima incident, and another one in Usharensk in Russia. But it took a long time for these stations to actually detect it. The speculation is that the North Korean scientists, after about 80 days, opened the tunnels and the xenon escaped. But it again goes back to the area where the test occurred, and this corresponds with the ellipses that you just saw earlier. As I mentioned, the ATM utilizes meteorological data that comes from a variety of sources. These are not owned or controlled by the CTBTO at all. We rely on the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast and the US National Center for Environmental Prediction to use their models, and the CTBTO then receives this. These are then put through a variety of models to come up with the atmospheric transport model that you just saw. Then we look at hydroacoustic stations. These are very expensive stations to give you an indication. The station that is being built here, in fact, costs about $25 million. They are located in particular areas of interest. often very deep. Of course, there are cables that need to run to a location on land that can be very, very long, and they have to withstand all the tough conditions in the ocean. Let's watch this short animation.
The white dots that we see here are hydroacoustic stations. Only 11 such stations are needed to monitor the oceans on Earth. This is because sound waves propagate very efficiently in the water. Here we can see an underwater event. This can be a volcano, an earthquake, or an explosion. Sound waves are created and move through the oceans. And when they hit a hydroacoustic station, they are registered by its hydrophones. Hydrophones are sensitive underwater microphones. They convert changes in water pressure into electrical signals. They are deployed at a depth where sound waves propagate most efficiently. As you can see, hydrophones are arranged in triplets. This helps us establish where the sound waves come from. There are cables on the seabed to transmit the signals. Depending on ocean floor topography, these cables can be up to 100 kilometers long. Near the shore, the cable is encased in protective layers and then led through a pipe to avoid the rough surf zone. Computers at the shore facility record the signal and prepare it for satellite transmission. Dish antennas transmit the data via satellites to the CTBTO in Vienna. All this is done automatically and takes only a few seconds. So here we see it again. Sound waves from an event are registered by the hydroacoustic sensors deep underwater, transmitted as electrical signals via cable to a shore facility, and then sent via satellite link to the CTBTO in Vienna, where the data are analyzed to clarify the nature of the event.
Of course, these hydroacoustic stations don't only pick up nuclear events. They pick up a lot of other events and other noises, including the noises that whales make. And some scientists are actually using the data collected by these stations to study whale migration. They're all equipped also with weather stations, so they can also indicate the change in ocean temperature that could be useful for the study of climate change. And very importantly, they have shown their use as part of tsunami warning, where obviously the waves, the movement, and the seismicity that's picked up as a result of an earthquake undersea can provide countries with data that allow them to issue early warnings for that. I'll say a few words about that later on. The final technology is infrasound. Infrasound is a highly specialized technology that has only been developed as of recently, and because it was not considered useful in the early days, because testing in the atmosphere were banned in any case. But as you will notice from the animation, it is well developed and very useful.
The white dots that we see here are 60 infrasound stations. They monitor the globe for atmospheric or shallow underground nuclear explosions. Such explosions create infrasound waves, low-frequency waves inaudible to the human ear. This event here could be a volcanic eruption, a storm, or an explosion, all creating infrasound waves that are registered by our infrasound stations. Such a station consists of several elements. This one has 8. The distance between the elements can vary from 1 to 3 kilometers. This is the best setup for trying to identify and locate the source of the infrasound waves. Each array element includes pipe structures to reduce the surrounding noise and amplify the signals. Filters at the end of these pipes prevent animals and dirt from entering them. When acoustic waves reach an infrasound station, the waves travel through these pipes to an infrasound sensor called a microbarometer. This is located in a vault at the center of each array element. It transforms the infrasound waves into electrical impulses. Each sensor transmits the signals to a central recording facility by radio or by fiber optics. This setup uses radio connections. At the facility, computers record the signals and prepare them for data transmission via satellite link to the CTBTO in Vienna. Everything proceeds automatically. And here we see the entire process again. Infrasound waves arrive at the station, are registered by the individual sensors, and transmitted as electrical signals via a radio connection to the central facility, and from there by satellite to the CTBTO in Vienna. There the data are analyzed to clarify the nature of the event.
Just a slide to show the global communication infrastructure. You'll see, as the animations also showed, that there are a number of, in fact, 5 geostationary satellites that are contracted by the CTBTO to serve as the means of delivery of the data as received from each of the stations that are transmitted to the International Data Center in Vienna, and then also transmitted to the national authorities in each of the countries. The final part that I like to emphasize is the on-site inspection. Now, the on-site inspection part of the regime is not set up yet formally because the treaty has not entered into force. The treaty is very specific that it can only be done once in force. However, a number of exercises have been conducted to test the organization's ability to organize such an inspection, and also the equipment and the technologies used to verify on-site whether a test occurred. Such a inspection would only be authorized by the Executive Council, which will be set up by the first conference of state parties once the treaty enters into force. And that council needs to, by vote, give a green light. That means 30 out of the 51 members of the council need to vote affirmatively that they wish an on-site inspection to occur. The interesting thing is they only have 96 hours to do so. So from the time when the future Director General receives a request from a state to conduct an on-site inspection on another state's territory based on data that the state received, then the council has 96 hours. And within that period, the organization must prepare itself to move literally hundreds of tons of equipment to a far location with inspectors to conduct inspections on site. Also important that the organization will not have a bank of permanent inspectors. They rely on inspectors that are trained but are basically surrogate. They would come only in for when a event of interest occurred. The last exercise that was held, our pictures that are shown on the slide, were held in Jordan, in an area that is typical of area where such tests could occur. I must emphasize this was not a test. They planted some very low radioactive materials and other items that would be similar to the aftermath of a test, but there was no nuclear test that was ever conducted in Jordan. This was simply an exercise. As you can see, there was a whole tent village. It took over a month. 53 countries participated, 150 tons of equipment were shipped there. And this created not only the opportunity to test the verification technologies the on-site inspection, but also generated major visibility in the CTBT, especially in the Middle East, where there are still a number of countries that have not yet ratified this treaty. Finally, I want to just briefly talk about the so-called civil and scientific applications of these technologies. So they are all designed to detect nuclear testing, but as I already referred to, they have other applications. Tsunami warning. The seismic stations serve to also provide states with data that could give them ample warning, or sometimes it's only minutes. But because of the speed that the data from the CTBT IMS stations travel via satellite to the states, the speeds are often faster, even if it's only by minutes to reach places. So while the December 2004 tsunami that hit Sumatra off the coast of Indonesia could not be avoided, subsequent signals have proven to be very useful. We must, however, emphasize that the CTBTO does not generate tsunami warnings. The CTBTO has agreements with a variety of countries and regional authorities that we provide, that the organization provide the data, and these countries and these stations benefit from that data. To come back to another very important civil and scientific application is the radiation release. In March 2011, we all can recall the tragic events in Japan when a massive earthquake off the coast resulted in a large tsunami that hit the two nuclear reactors, causing severe damage and also a loss of life as a result of the tsunami. Now, the organization's role in this was quite significant, since its array of radionuclide station and its atmospheric transport modeling helped people to understand and governments to understand where the plume would go, and also that it was way below, the radioactivity was way below what was considered dangerous for humans. So here's a short animation to show how the organization contributed to the civil application of technologies that was actually used as for public health and safety as opposed for nuclear security.
This animation shows how radioactive emissions spread from the Fukushima nuclear power plant following the devastating earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan on 11th of March 2011. CTBTO's radionuclide monitoring stations, highlighted here as purple diamonds, recorded and tracked the unfolding crisis to keep authorities informed. It starts at the Takasaki radionuclide station, around 200 kilometers away from the troubled plant. Within 4 days, the dispersion of minuscule amounts of radioactive isotopes were detected in eastern Russia and then traveled to the west coast of the United States. Mika Nikkanen, CTBTO head, Scientific Methods.
We have to stress always that these detection levels that we saw are not harmful for human beings, as our detection capability is at least 1 billion times lower to the level that is harmful for human beings.
By day 15, traces from the accident in Fukushima were detectable all across the Northern Hemisphere, where it remained, with the equator initially acting as a dividing line between the northern and southern air masses. But in a little over a month, traces from the release had reached the Southern Hemisphere.
There are a number of other applications as well where the atmospheric transport modeling can be used to avoid aviation hazards as a result of volcanic eruptions, study meteorite entry into the atmosphere, etc. So the last part of my this talk is to keep the organization scientifically relevant and up to date every second year, a major scientific conference is held in Vienna, Austria, where hundreds of scientists from around the world come together to exchange knowledge and to share ideas on how to improve the monitoring and verification technologies, but also how they use these technologies in other ways. And so here, the message that I have for especially younger scientists and prospective scientists that are still at high school is, here's a massive opportunity for you to get involved, study science, and eventually become part of this larger group of scientists around the world that contribute to international peace and security, but also to safety and health and other benefits that these technologies provide. So Masako, if there are any questions before we break.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really fascinating to understand CTBT has such a strong verification regimes even before the treaty entered into force. So that really makes me think. So do you think, so this such a strong verification regime is really rare in international multilateral treaty? Do you think, compared to other international non-proliferation treaty, do you think CTBT is really unique in terms of this strong verification regime?
Absolutely, and I'm not saying this because I worked there for 7 years. This is the only multilateral verification system. Let's think about other treaties. First of all, I mentioned earlier the partial test ban treaty. It had no verification system. It relied on the goodwill of states to use their own verification system, and the only ones that had it in those days were Russia or Soviet Union and the United States. They were certainly not going to, tell the world that they tested a nuclear weapon. Then look at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was negotiated in 1968. It has a verification system, basically, that would ask the International Atomic Energy Agency to verify compliance by states without nuclear weapons, that they will not acquire nuclear weapons. But it has no verification of the states with nuclear weapons that they promised in terms of the treaty that they will give up their nuclear weapons. There's no verification. So those are the two only other big treaties out there in this field. There's been other treaties with some verification mechanisms, but these are more in the consultation business or exchange of visits between the United States and Russia in terms of dismantlement of facilities, of overflights of planes and missiles and so forth. The only other treaty that they're trying to negotiate and have been trying to do since 1998 is the so-called Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which will be designed, like the CTBT, to ban the production of material that could be used in nuclear explosions, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. But they have done nothing to conclude that. If that treaty is concluded, one can imagine it will have a need to have a verification system. And in fact, the organization has been working closely with a number of scientific groups and also diplomats in Geneva to share with them the lessons learned from the CTBT. But the short answer is that there is no other multilateral verification system. And why this is important, Masako, is if you recall that map with all those stations around the world that are spread out from the smallest countries to the most powerful ones. Once a nuclear explosion happens or an event of suspicion happens, it is not only the countries with the largest military or the largest technological base on the Security Council, which will inevitably be first and foremost the P5, to tell the lesser countries, countries with smaller industries or with no military whatsoever, that a nuclear test occurred. Why? Because all the countries would have access to the same data, exactly the same data. No one can alter the data because it's impossible to, if a station is turned off at one of those locations, the people in Vienna, there's an operations room, they see that station being turned off. Now it can be turned off for a variety of reasons. It could run out of power, or it could be some other reason. Then they need to fix it. But if a group of stations suddenly gets turned off, that leads to suspicion. You can't manipulate the data because the data belongs to everyone. So it's not that the CTBTO sits on the data and say, well, this is what we saw. No, the data, in fact, the treaty is very clear. Say the data, that the information regarding a suspicion event must come from the national data centers. So if there's a decision that there's a suspicious event, that comes not from the CTBTO, but in fact from the national states themselves. So it's very difficult to manipulate that. And so when the council meets, and for instance, if you take back 2009, why this happened to be the day that I joined the CTBTO when North Korea conducted its second test, the Security Council met at 3 o'clock that afternoon. And the Security Council members, obviously the P5 had their data, but they also received from the CTBTO. But countries such as Costa Rica, that doesn't even have an army, Austria, small African countries on the West African countries, who were all in the council, they didn't have access to their own national data. They received the data from the CTBT. There was no dispute that this was a test. And so this is what I would like to call the democratization of verification, because it's not only the big boys and the big countries that sit on this data, but every small country has the access to it. And the organization does a lot of work in training scientists, people to analyze the data, the station operators. Each of those stations have an operator, sometimes more, to make sure the station is in full operation, is maintained and so forth. So that means that capacity is created. And again, talking to students and talking to teachers, it's really important for students who are interested in any of these sciences. If you are interested in seismicity, you think you're going to study the movement of the earth and the signature of the earth. Well, yes, that's very important, but there's also a way that you can take that scientific knowledge and contribute to international peace and security.
Thank you so much. So now I hope students are more motivated to study science.
Absolutely, I hope so.
So on that note, why don't we take a 5 minutes break here? Then let me stop recording right now. Then we can come back in 5 minutes. Thank you, John.
Right.
Okay, now it's yours.
Very good. Welcome back, everyone. We are now in sort of the last part of the talk. And what we're going to look at is the role of the CTBT and nuclear non-proliferation disarmament regime, current challenges and future prospects. I do not have a crystal ball, but I can rely on my experience, not only at the CTBT, but in the broader context of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, to share some ideas with you. So while the previous talk was very scientific, the one before that was historic based, a lot of this depends on current politics. As I mentioned, this is a technical verification treaty with a political problem, and you'll soon understand why. First of all, over the years, there's been strong international response to nuclear proliferation. We saw earlier on the arms race as it unfolded through nuclear testing and the development of nuclear weapons, but the international response to that was pretty strong. We saw bilateral arms control treaties between essentially the Soviet Union, later Russia, and the United States. We saw the negotiation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We saw the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones, declaring entire parts of the world nuclear weapon-free. We saw the development of and the establishment of the IEA and its safeguard system. Of course, the CTBT, export control regimes designed to prevent the proliferation of specific technologies that could be used in weapons of mass destruction, but also have other uses. And then we've seen a number of responses to the threat of nuclear terrorism that has become far more of a threat to international peace and security than it was ever considered to be at the time of the negotiation of the NPT and even the CTBT and so forth. So this is the environment in which the CTBT operates in. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you have certainly had background talks on this as well, just to recap in particular how it is relevant to the CTBT. It opened for signature in 1968 after some negotiations starting soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it has three main pillars: non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses. It has a number of articles under each of these. Disarmament is Article 6. Non-proliferation is Articles 1 and 2. Basically, states with nuclear weapons will not share them. Other states without nuclear weapons will not acquire them. And it has an article or two articles related to how to use the peaceful application of the atom and not to proliferate. It has a review conference every 5 years to review the implementation. It is almost universal, as you can see from the map. There are very few countries that are not members of it. The countries that are not members are India, Pakistan, North Korea, and then what you see there is South Sudan. Obviously, given the establishment of South Sudan after the revolution, it is not really in a position to sign up to any treaties yet, but and then of course Israel. Interesting, of course, is there's an overlap between the countries that have not ratified or signed the CTBT and those who don't belong to the NPT. Very importantly, though, in terms of the political obligations given by especially the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, in addition to the Article 6 obligation, which obligate them to negotiate in good faith, to put an end to the arms race, and to establish nuclear disarmament. They have agreed in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaties Review Conference and Extension Conference in '95 to an exchange for the indefinite extension of this treaty, which, by the way, would allow them to keep their nuclear weapons if they interpret the treaty the way that they do. The rest of the world disagree. But they agreed that they will proceed quickly with negotiations for a CTBT. They also agreed to proceed with a resolution to the Middle East issue, which obviously will relate to concerns over Israel's nuclear program and other programs in the Middle East. Following that, the review conference of the treaty in the year 2000 adopted a number of steps as part of an agreed outcome document. Amongst those were 13 practical steps. Interesting enough, the CTBT was listed as number one to negotiate, to implement the treaty, bearing in mind that after the '95 review conference, the CTBT was finally negotiated in '96, partly as a result of that conference. So 2000 called on all states to join and to support the treaty. It also called on the states with nuclear weapons that have not yet ratified the treaty to maintain its moratoria. And then in 2010, the last review conference that came up with the final document adopted 64 action plans that range from non-proliferation to arms control to disarmament, to peaceful uses, to nuclear terrorism. And amongst those were 5 specific plans for the CTBT. Obviously, entry into force, but also calling on NPT members to support the international monitoring system and the effective implementation of the treaty. This is just a slide to show again the 3 pillars. So often people ask, but where does the CTBT fit here? Because although it fits into the disarmament plan of the 2000 review conference, it does not have any disarmament provisions. And it's true, the CTBT does not have a disarmament provision. And I'll come to how it actually contributes to disarmament. But it also contributes to non-proliferation. Because especially when states that have nuclear weapons cannot conduct tests on states that don't have them, but they can also not share technologies. And since it has been proven through technology, but also history, that with every test, the advancement of weapons improve, that is called vertical proliferation. And so providing that there's no test, that provides, adds to countries' commitment to the non-proliferation pillar of the treaty. Another very important category of the nuclear non-proliferation regime is nuclear weapon-free zones. They are specified regions based on treaties negotiated and signed by the states of that region to commit themselves not to manufacture, acquire, test, or possess nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapon-free zone countries may use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and that's verified also through their IAEA safeguard system. But very interesting that the nuclear weapon-free zone requires the nuclear weapon states, as recognized by the NPT, China, France, Russia, UK, and the US, to respect the status of these zones and to not to use, not to threaten to use, and not to test nuclear weapons on those countries' territory. So you'll see that there's large swaths of the world that is covered by these treaties. 39% of the world's population already, most of the southern hemisphere. One of the areas that, of course, are of great concern at the moment is the Middle East. Attempts to negotiate such a zone have been made, but have not yet been successful. I'm also often asked, what is the difference between the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the CTBTO? Well, while they are two organizations based in the same complex building in the Vienna International Center in Vienna, they have two different objectives, leading and in some cases, complementing each other. So in addition to the IAEA's role in promoting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, by the way, which is its primary function, the IAEA is also tasked to ensure the non-diversion of this material to military purposes. So to come back to this slide, this is a very basic schematic version of the nuclear fuel cycle. Basically, the nuclear material comes out of the ground, it's refined, and then is enriched. And then that is a point where it could potentially lead to proliferation. Later on, plutonium is extracted after the reactors are processed, and that's another point where it could lead. So the CTBT has nothing to do with that. The CTBT falls on the other end, where they test the nuclear weapon. Basically, is that last line in the sand. So a state can acquire the technology, provided it meets the IAEA's standards. But if it's caught cheating by the IAEA, then there's a process that it needs to go through. But once it tests, there is no denial that it had a nuclear weapon. So the verification of the objective of the CTBT is no test. The IAEA has different instruments, and of course we just already saw what the instruments are that the CTBT uses. So there is communication between the organizations. They cooperate on technical levels. They have, and to a large extent, same membership, but it's two completely separate organizations with completely separate budgets and have political differences in some cases. What I'd like to do is quickly explain the role of the CTBT in international peace and security. First of all, we've seen this alarm system. So it is backed up with a robust verification regime, so it's a reality check. It really gives countries confidence that a state does not have nuclear weapons. As I mentioned in one of the questions that Masako had, it binds all states, and it's also very balanced and transparency based on democratic principles. All states have access to all data, and there's no difference between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. It contributes to stemming horizontal proliferation. It lowers the political benefit and raises the cost of proliferation. It also constrains the development and quantitative improvement of nuclear weapons. On the disarmament side, and this is very important, since nuclear testing adds to or contributes to the arms race, to reverse the arms race, towards deep reductions, you can't do that in the atmosphere of continued nuclear testing. One can argue that the reduction of nuclear warheads between Russia and the US, that although still not zero, but has been significant over the years, would not have taken place in the environment of continued nuclear testing by either one of them or some of their adversaries. So this is how the CTBT contributes. It also leads states to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. So a military commander cannot be confident that a operational nuclear weapon has not been tested. So there's no confidence in that nuclear weapon because it's not been tested. So it complicates military planning, and therefore nuclear weapons are no longer considered to be really useful in the military. Far more advanced conventional weapons exist. And it is vital to move towards multilateral disarmament. Article 6 of the NPT makes it very clear that all states must contribute to nuclear disarmament. So how can states contribute to nuclear disarmament if they don't have nuclear weapons? The CTBT is a good example of that. Again, Masaku's question about the multilateral aspect of it is really important because this gives confidence that states abide by an international norm, that norm being no testing, nowhere. Then it strengthens the norm of non-proliferation. There's a toolbox. Imagine a toolbox. In that toolbox is export controls. There's the IEA safeguards. There's a number of other tools. In that toolbox also is the CTBT. And in fact, the NPT parties have recognized that it is part of that toolbox. When in 2010, it actually declared that it's a core element of the regime. And as I mentioned earlier, it's that final downstream barrier. If safeguards is the first legal barrier against the acquisition of nuclear weapons, the CTBT is the final last one. And finally, it enhances regional security and peace and confidence. Since all the nuclear weapon-free zones have embedded in those treaties that there will be no weapons, no fissile material, and no tests. So the CTBT is challenged. So how do we make the impossible possible? This vessel is on its way to Antarctica to install radionuclide station RM-73 in one of the most difficult to reach areas of the world. If scientists can do that, then why can politicians not get this right? So this is the political challenge, and this is to figure out how to get out of this conundrum that is created by the entry into force clause. To recap again, 44 states must ratify the treaty for its entry into force. 8 have not yet done so, 3 have not yet signed, and the other 5 still need to ratify. Again, this map shows the majority of the world committed to ban nuclear testing forever, except for a few. And those few are actually holding the world hostage that could perhaps lead to the resumption of nuclear testing. And so the countries that have already agreed not to do so are in fact victims of the political inability of those others. And there's a major link, and I must emphasize that if you look on this map, and the map is obviously too small to see all the countries, but look at the problem area here. And if you look at a map of the NPT, then you see a similar problem area. But this area is linked to the Middle East. It is all linked. And this area is also linked through the Pacific to the United States. So the CTBT has an Asia-Pacific problem. And that is not delinked from the other problems. So the CTBT cannot just be seen as isolation from the existing political differences in those amongst those countries, because they're all strategically linked. The United States is linked to China. The United States is linked to North Korea. Israel, Egypt, and Iran are linked. Pakistan and India are linked. India is linked to China. North Korea has an issue with the United States, so you can understand how these, but they also have domestic issues. We all know that this is a domestic problem in the United States for many years, that the Senate voted not to give its consent to ratification as way back as 1999. And indications are this is not going to happen soon, although a lot of work has been done by the Obama administration. But similarly, in China, a lot of work's been done, but there still remains opposition. India has not been interested in this treaty for many, many years. Pakistan has given some interesting signals. Israel has given some signals. Iran has recently concluded the joint cooperation agreement with the United States and the P5 plus one. So there's movement, but yet these countries are all linked. The domestic issues are not pushing hard enough for them to sign or ratify the treaty. So people often say, well, maybe if the United States ratify first, then the other dominoes will fall. For instance, maybe the United States and China are linked. There's sufficient speculation to indicate that China may ratify as soon as the United States does, or may even ratify it soon before it. There's also a clear linkage between India and the United States, given the US-India deal that led to attempts by India to become a member of the nuclear suppliers group. Pakistan has clearly stated it will sign and ratify the treaty once India does. There's also a link between Israel, Egypt, and Iran. Those are also linked in part to the United States. The potential of negotiating the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone will pave the way also for ratification by those three states. Of course, the DPRK, there should actually be a link also with the US, although a very vague link. The DPRK's acquisition of nuclear weapons is from their perspective, clearly also to send a signal to the United States, whether you like it or not. But, the DPRK's issue can be resolved by dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue. After you remove the nuclear program, there would be no reason for the DPRK not to sign or ratify this treaty. But why wait for the United States? China can ratify this treaty easily. It has a far easier process. It does not have the domestic problems that the United States have with us. China's ratification could inspire countries such as India and Pakistan. It could also, given China's role these days, both geopolitically, regionally, and in terms of its bilateral and trade relations with countries, could inspire countries such as Iran to ratify. That could in turn also put pressure on Egypt and Israel. China's direct relationship with the DPRK could push DPRK to give up its nuclear program and ratify. And of course, it could serve as a major incentive for the United States to follow. But why wait for any state? All these states can do so. They can come in some kind of an agreement with each other. A few of them can do so together. For instance, there's been talk about Israel, Egypt, and Iran coming up with some formula that they can do it. India and Pakistan can do it. China and the United States can agree with each other. They will do it together. But there should not be any state waiting for the others. President Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry, Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Rose Gottmuller have all called and said that other countries should not wait for the United States. Given that there's just been a presidential election, that there's going to be a change in administration, this is an opportunity for these states to take the leadership, take the initiative, and ratify this treaty and set the example. That would also serve as a legacy for these states, given the long history that this treaty has had. Can the world rely on these moratoria? We've seen it fail again. It can fail again. I do not want to sketch a very negative picture, but it will only take, without North Korea, one other state to start nuclear testing. And this whole issue we can see this chart building up again to times of increased nuclear testing. That is not a safe and secure world to live in. So the opportunities exist. The member states of the treaty meet often. They meet in New York at ministerial level. The current Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, is a strong supporter. In fact, he was a chairman of the PrepCom, and he himself has said that the time for waiting has passed. We must make the most of the existing and potentially short-lived opportunities. Jokingly, he's also said that his name is Ban Ki-moon, ban nuclear testing. The Executive Secretary Zaro established a group of eminent persons. These are high-level people, some of them in government, some are former government, foreign ministers, heads of state, that are pushing and a dynamic way for the Article 14 process, as well as the entry into force of the treaty. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the treaty. 20 years ago, the treaty was finally negotiated and signed. So this year, a number of events has been held in Vienna and elsewhere, including a ministerial meeting. There was a symposium on science and diplomacy that was held in Vienna that some of the participants, I think, in this forum participated in, and many of the slides that I actually used came from that symposium. All of that material is recorded on the website and is freely available should you be interested. There's been other high-level meetings where the Secretary General spoke, and then there was also a meeting in New York that was held with a group of ministers and the Secretary General. Security Council took decision in September this year. Was an initiative led by the United States. The Security Council adopted with 14 votes against 1 abstention, that was Egypt, stressing the vital importance of an urgency of entry into force, called on all states to refrain from conducting any nuclear weapon test, so including obviously the P5, which is significant. They recognize that even in the absence of entry into force of the treaty, the monitoring system already contributes to regional stability and is a significant confidence building measure, and that it strengthens the regime, and that the treaty's entry into force will contribute to the enhancement of international peace and security. This is a very, very important initiative taken by the Security Council, and the consequences and the ramification of that is not still fully understood. Technical challenges. This system costs upwards of $1 billion. These are stations that rely on a number of issues. It relies on power. It relies on maintenance. It relies on the timely transmission of the data. It relies on completing the system. It's not fully complete yet. So any of these are breakdown points. Many of the stations would need to be replaced. A seismic station could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A hydroacoustic station, $25 million. So you can imagine that if the political interest in the treaty starts waning as a result of lack of entry into force, then eventually countries may say, well, we can't afford paying for the system anymore. And perhaps we need to look at alternatives. And that would be, to come back to Masako's earlier point, the death of the only truly multilateral verification system for arms control and disarmament, the CTBT. It operates in a tough environment. You can imagine that a cable, as these people are lying over 100 kilometers, can break, and a tsunami can wash away that station. To work in the Antarctic is harsh enough. To make sure that the station operates 24/7 is quite a challenge. The analyst must find that proverbial needle in the haystack. What happens if they miss it because there are not enough analysts, or people lose interest, and a nuclear explosion goes undetected? That would also be a very significant setback for the treaty. Financial challenge. The CTBTO's budget is about $116 million per year. That's, by the way, smaller than the IEA Safeguards Department. But the CTBTO must maintain that whole system of $1 billion+. So what happens if states don't pay? Although the collection rate by the CTBTO, meaning the contributions that states make, is quite high, probably one of the highest of international organizations. Time will only tell whether states will be willing to do so indefinitely in the absence of entry into force. And that will be a significant problem for the organization, because then it cannot continue to build the stations, and it cannot reliably monitor the data and provide the data products to its member states. So here's some food for thought. These are questions that are intentionally provocative. They don't represent in any way my own views on their answers. They are designed to allow teachers and students to discuss in classrooms, in small groups, about some issues. They are not inclusive. There are many other questions. We can have far more time than I'm allowed to discuss them. But for instance, what will happen if the treaty never enters force? Are there any other options to implement and enforce the treaty? Pending entry into force, could the CTBTO, for instance, be mandated to carry out an on-site inspection? Example here, for instance, is the OPC, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the United Nations Security Council cooperated together to remove chemical weapons from Syria. And that pushed Syria to, first of all, sign that convention, but moved to remove the weapons from Syria. Can that be done in terms of international law? If one considers the dynamics that led to the entry into force provision, which was extremely complicated, if you had to redesign this treaty, would you propose a different provision for entry into force? Why is this important? Well, there's a fissile material treaty that hopefully will soon, the negotiations will soon start. What will your solution be for those negotiators to do something different and not make the mistake that was made in the CTBT? And then finally, there is a strong movement and a good movement moving to strengthen nuclear disarmament. There's been the movement to move the humanitarian consequence and humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons from a largely NGO-supported movement right into the General Assembly, where the General Assembly has now agreed to start negotiations on a potential treaty banning nuclear weapons. Now, this is significant, but it is going to be very difficult, time-consuming, if at all possible. So how does this relate to the CTBT and a future fissile material treaty, where some argue that instead of focusing on these treaties, we should just go for the end goal? This could be complicated because there must be a step-by-step. First, you have to make sure there's no testing, there's no production, and that the numbers come down, because you can't negotiate between some cases with 7,000 nuclear weapons and others with 10. So these are all very important questions that I invite you to ponder on, discuss amongst yourselves, and hopefully come up with answers. And if not for anyone, let Masako know if you find those answers. Finally, I want to provide some educational resources that is available to train the next generation of CTBT experts. On the CTBTO website, there are a number of live lecture courses. The organization have offered live courses in classroom that's been recorded and available online. There's a very robust iTunes U page with courses on there. And there's a number of partnership with universities. If any of the university teachers of schools are interested to partnership with the CTBT, go onto this website. And there are ways to register for the website, and you will find ways to contact it's my former section that is spearheading this campaign, and you'll find a lot of information available. It will guide you on how to set up an account. It's all free, and it's a very useful resource. CTBT Executive Secretary Lassina Zagro established earlier this year a CTBTO youth group. The idea here is that we cannot rely on today's generation or even the past generation to ensure the safety and security of the next generation, the world and the next generation. So younger people needs to be inspired, and they inspire others. So this is a group that has been established. It's open to all students and young professionals and who are interested in directing their careers towards global peace and security, including in the scientific field. There are already about 60 students and young professionals, and I'm aware that there will be a talk by some members of the group, some of them who are students here at the Middlebury Institute. So the CTBTO staff work together with these students to provide them with the material, to train them, so that their individual voices could join up with others, including the CTBTO, the group of eminent persons, other world leaders, because it has been proven over and over again that the youth inspires people. And especially also through the use of modern day communication media, we look forward, and I'm not speaking as a CTBT or former CTBT official, I'm speaking as an individual, look forward on the next generation, those of you who are at high school, the teachers that enable them to lead the charge for this treaty to enter into force. Again, for this group, for the wider group, I invite you to make use of the material on the CTBTO webpage. There's a number of interesting portals and specific self-paced tutorials that you can use in your classroom with questions, multiple choice questions that is fun for students. They are relatively short, about 45 minutes each. And they are in a variety of packages that you could probably use as part of your curriculum. These are just examples of the questions. And then finally, there's a very interesting little YouTube video that I will finally let you to watch. It's very short, animated, quite funny. A good introduction to the treaty to break the ice in your classroom if you want to do that.
The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty prohibits all nuclear explosions anywhere on Earth for any purpose, period, though as of 2015 it still remains to be signed and or locally ratified in a few important places. In spite of this, the Test Ban Preparatory Commission has already developed a monitoring system that can detect pretty much any nuclear explosion that takes place anywhere on, above, or inside the Earth. Here's how it works. Nuclear explosions release a lot of energy, much of it in the form of blast waves that radiate outwards through the air, water, or ground. These waves travel at the speed of sound in the air, water, or rock, so if you detect them in multiple places, you can triangulate exactly where and when the blast occurred. Simple in principle, complicated in practice. Atmospheric explosions are monitored by a global network of infrasound detectors. They detect the super long wavelength, low frequency sound waves generated by storms, glaciers, volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, rocket launches, space shuttle disasters, and yes, nuclear explosions. However, nuclear explosions are so much more intense than pretty much anything else that happens in the atmosphere that an atmospheric blast is pretty easy to detect. Underwater detonations are monitored by hydroacoustic sensors, basically super sensitive underwater microphones floating above the ocean floor. And like in the atmosphere, underwater nuclear blasts are pretty easy to detect because there's just nothing else that violent that happens in the oceans. Underground explosions are the tough ones. They're monitored using seismometers, the same tools that detect earthquakes. And as you might expect, they mainly detect earthquakes. Big earthquakes, small earthquakes, and lots of tiny earthquakes. And volcanic eruptions, and mining explosions, and even airplane crashes. Scientists have gotten to know these non-nuclear blasts pretty well, so when they saw large, unusual disturbances beneath North Korea in 2006, 2009, and 2013, they concluded correctly that these were nuclear explosions. However, while all three wave techniques, waves in air, waves in water, and waves in earth, can triangulate the location of a major disturbance and even give some insight into its nature, a fourth technique is critical in order to know for sure if an explosion was nuclear or not: radionuclide detection. 80 stations around the world sample the air for radioactive dust and gases that are smoking gun signals of nuclear activity, which, combined with sophisticated atmospheric airflow modeling, allows us to both predict where fallout will disperse and retrodict the general location of its source. But in the case of a perfectly contained secret underground or deep ocean explosion, there might be no radioactive fallout. So if seismographs and hydroacoustic sensors pick up a suspicious signal, there's one final weapon in the international monitoring system's arsenal: sending on-the-ground inspection teams to the actual location. Except inspection teams won't actually be legal until the treaty is fully signed and ratified. That's you, US, China, Israel, Egypt, Iran, India, Pakistan, North Korea. The world is waiting. This video was made possible by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, though any political views expressed are my own. Come on, America, let's ratify the treaty now. The CTBTO Preparatory Commission developed and implemented the international monitoring system I described, and they're constantly seeking to improve the sensitivity of their sensors and the sophistication of their data analyses. They also make all their data available to the worldwide scientific community so that other researchers can, for example, predict and monitor tsunami, study the structure of the Earth, search for downed airplanes, do their own analysis of nuclear blasts, or track whale migrations or meteors in the upper atmosphere or radioactive fallout from nuclear power plant failures. In short, the CTBTO is a collaborative endeavor of people around the world using science to help prevent people from doing horrible things to each other with science. And in the process, they happen to be generating a lot of positive scientific side effects. The CTBTO didn't ask me to say this, but after learning about their work, I want to thank them for making the world a safer place for millions, if not billions, of people.
With that, I will leave you with that thought, is that the CTBT, with your help, can make the world a far safer place. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I now have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking lecture. So, Karen, I see one teacher is here. So, if you have any question, just raise your hand and send me your message through this chat box. So, what I do have actually a few questions. So, my question is, my first question is, going back to your lecture on the relationship between CTBT and nuclear disarmament. That is my big question. So, although CTBT has not entered into force, currently, internationally, there is a very strong norm against nuclear weapons testing, with the exception of North Korea. But basically, with the exception of North Korea, no one was conducting nuclear weapons testing. Then, in terms of nuclear disarmament, CTBT is contributing to strengthen non-proliferation norm, but I am wondering how CTBT can contribute to strengthen norm against nuclear weapons, including nuclear position, like maybe current development on a decision to start negotiating a nuclear ban treaty. So, would you share your thoughts on how we could interrelate between nuclear test ban treaty and the nuclear ban?
Very good, Masako. If you allow me to briefly go back to 2 slides, then I think it's the one slide is this one, what we in the CTBT used to call the thermometer or of international peace and security. So again, these are all the nuclear tests occurred, and this is a time here when the arms race and the Cold War was at its hottest, where nuclear weapon stockpile went up to 80,000 weapons. Up from 1996 onwards, even earlier, with the CTBT in mind, and bear in mind that when President Clinton took the decision to issue a moratoria on US nuclear weapons, and also the Russians did the same, they did so with the CTBT in mind. In fact, President Clinton, and I'm paraphrasing his words, were in the declaration that now that the CTBT is possible, the US does not need to test anymore. Right? So that's just the background. But in this environment, and as yourself said, with the exception of North Korea, the norm exists. It is flat. Even for India and Pakistan, that norm exists. There's no noise, right? We get this occasional naughty child syndrome there that seeking attention, but it is flat. So the norm against nuclear testing exists because the CTBT is, although not de jure in effect, is de facto in effect. And that undescribes the norm. Now, for the teachers and others who are interested in norm theory, you get this idea of a waterfall. So the waterfall is already, it's cascading. The norm is coming down. It has not yet been completely internalized by all the states, because there's still 8 out there that still need to do it. But even those states, the United States, China, will not test because this norm exists. It is almost internalized in their own countries. That contributes to the environment where deeper reductions can take place. It also prevents them from developing far more destructive and modern weapons. So they must rely, and I showed that one slide, the W-88 warhead is the prime warhead that is in US nuclear weapons. That thing is old. It uses the same pits and same technology. Okay, some of that has been modernized with non-critical testing. But the essential design of that weapon remains the same. So if a country wants to come up with a brand new weapon system that's contrary to its disarmament, it needs to test. And so eventually these weapons will become defunct and states will have to reduce them. Now, can I honestly say that the CTBT has a direct relationship to complete elimination of nuclear weapons? No. But it contributes to the environment that could lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons. So I think that's important. The other slide that I want to go back to is this slide. About the downwinders. So this is the humanitarian impact of nuclear testing. Now, we don't have to remind ourselves, you in particular as a national from Japan, about the humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons. It only happened twice, and no one will ever forget that, right? And I think in part, and this is a very tragic way to look at it, that is why it has never happened again, because these things have been so destructive. But one must not forget that a nuclear test is in fact the use of a nuclear weapon. It's not designed to destroy cities or people, but they are using a nuclear weapon to develop a better one. And I want to, maybe this is a good discussion topic for teachers. If you live anywhere in any of these states, not just in Nevada, or in Kazakhstan or in Russia, and you're just a normal citizen, you know nothing about these things, and someone asks you, if we're going to resume testing to develop better weapons, you're going to get impacted by this, because today, what do we have? The science is better, but even more multimedia and social media make people far more aware of what they were 30 years ago. So my summation of this is that people will rebel. People will say, no, we will not allow more testing. So what does that mean? That people are getting involved. This whole nuclear disarmament movement, although not as vibrant as it was in the 60s and 70s when you had a million people marches in the street, and especially on the nuclear test, people were chaining themselves to nuclear facilities, it's not as vibrant, but it needs to be. And so I think if people understand, and I think this Critical Issues Forum is vital to creating that understand the link between the dangers of nuclear testing and the need for nuclear disarmament, because yes, there's been testing for a long, long time in the United States and Russia and in China and so on. But that doesn't mean that that threat is not there. And so we have to deal with that threat that could allow the community, but including these states with weapons, to focus on that other goal. And that goal is to eliminate the weapons.
Thank you so much. So now we have a question from Karen, a teacher from Pacific Group. So let me unmute. Okay, so now you can talk, Karen.
Thank you, John, for the very informative and interesting presentation. You mentioned that a large reason why the states that have not ratified the CTBT have not tested is the norm, as you state. Can you imagine a scenario in which a country might resume testing? And how might we be able to prevent such a scenario? Are those, in the conversation?
Corinne, thanks for a difficult question. First of all, I'm very pleased that Pacific Grove joined us. Since I live almost next to the school, I would be very pleased to come and talk to your students if that is part of your plan.
That would be wonderful.
The problem here is that it can happen. And again, the fever chart is a way to look at it. You can look at the dominoes. So a scenario that I will not name the countries, although I'm no longer a diplomat, so I can name the countries. So for instance, and this is just a scenario. So this is not my view, definitely not the view of the CTBT. But say, for instance, Pakistan, given Pakistan's concerns that it does not have parity with India in terms of its conventional forces, but also its nuclear forces, Pakistan decides it needs to test a thermonuclear device, which it has not done. Pakistan tests such a device. Domestically, while technically India may not need to test, domestically there will be huge pressure on India to do so. India is likely to follow suit and also test. Some scientists in India would like it because they too want to maybe improve their designs. Now you have two states on the border of China that have, when they entered the nuclear club in 1998, they were not a threat to China. Those are not adversaries of China, but India's had some, over the history of time, some issues with China. But domestically, can one imagine that China would just sit there and allow these two nuclear states, and they are, to do that? Now again, this is controversial. I don't believe it will happen, but it could. You ask for a scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Now China decides, maybe we should test. That's the death of the treaty.
Right.
Because the United States, I cannot imagine. I've seen a change in guard. I can even imagine that there would be some Russian generals that may consider Russia's full adherence. Russia's ratified the treaty. And there's no concerns over Russia's conduct. But if China is going to test the United States, can you imagine the Russians are just going to sit still and do nothing? By the way, Russia has
I cannot.
a new trial. They have introduced a new delivery system, new warheads. So one can imagine that there's some itchy generals down there to say, this is an opportunity to test. So to make the long, very dangerous scenario very short is any one of these states can trigger the entry into force of the treaty. Perhaps with the exception of North Korea, provided they don't continue to test, any one of them can lead to the eventual demise of the treaty. I hope that is not too bleak of a picture.
Yeah.
So please write your congressman or senator.
Right.
Thank you. Do you have any additional question, Karen? No?
What other kinds of scientific experiments do countries such as the US or Russia do to simulate nuclear explosions since they can't test?
Well, as I mentioned, and I wanted to keep this relatively short.
And you may have answered this in an earlier presentation.
Yeah, we quickly go to that slide. This is kind of controversial. I must be upfront with you.
Mm-hmm.
When the treaty was negotiated, there were attempts by the United States and Russia to allow some low-yield testing that, as they put it, would be military insignificant. If you've conducted, like the United States, more than 1,000 tests, then doing a 1 kiloton test would not really be of any significance to develop your nuclear arsenal.
Right.
But they argued that such tests would allow, especially the safety of and the reliability of the weapons, to make sure that they don't go off accidentally and so on. Right?
Right.
This was shut out. I mean, the non-nuclear weapon stage, they completely shut it down. And so it's a true zero yield testing. There's no explosive yield. But when President Clinton announced in 1992 that the United States will cease testing, he made two other announcements at the same time, in that there would be a stockpile stewardship program that would allow the United States to join the CTBT. And in fact, there has been several studies, most notably by the National Academy of Science, and two separate studies over about 10 years apart, that found that the stewardship program is very robust, and that the United States does not need to test nuclear weapons ever again. And this is now is built into the Obama administration's nuclear policies. But they conduct a number of experiments. People call them tests, but they are really experiments to look at the conditions and how fissile material, for instance, will react under certain circumstances. Up at Livermore, they have a very large facility with lasers that pinpoint on a very, very small, almost the size of a pea of critical material, to see what the reaction would be, to simulate a potential nuclear reaction. They do computer simulation to make sure that the mechanisms in the weapon is still viable. Now, there are countries, and I'll be upfront here, many countries, that believe that this undermines the spirit of the CTBT. If the spirit of the CTBT is to ban nuclear testing, which leads to nuclear disarmament, create the environment, then this undermines it, because the countries with weapons will have the technical means, although non-explosive, to make sure that their weapons continue to work. So the boat keeps leaking a bit. It's not completely plugged because of these. That's what these countries believe. And this is a significant group of countries. Some European, very much sort of what they call the non-aligned countries of the old days that were not aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. So there are some, and the problem with that, of course, at the time when the treaty is under severe political pressure, and who knows what will happen with the new US, Trump administration. We don't have any idea where they will go. I hope they will see the value of this treaty like other world leaders have done. But for the friends of the treaty to raise criticisms of this treaty at a time when it needs strong support, in my view, is quite dangerous. I mean, they were deliberately excluded from the treaty to enable the states with nuclear weapons to, in fact, stop testing.
Okay.
So I just want to clarify a point. So you said, so there are a number of countries who are against these alternative scientific experiments because they feel that it undermines the CTBT. Are you saying that also is detrimental to being able to?
Well, in my view, in fact, this is a bit of a conundrum that I've seen play off on the conference floors in Vienna. When a country, the United States, for instance, but not just the United States, France and the UK are also notorious for doing this. They would come and announce on the public stage, well, they've conducted these tests, and it's not secret. It's on their websites and so on. You can find all these tests that have been conducted. And that this enables them to continue support the CTBT and its goals. That's kind of waving a red flag in front of the ball. So other countries would then say, no, but you see, you are undermining the spirit of the treaty, and then, you know, you have a big political issue going on. So when the treaty, I mean, no treaty is perfect.
Right.
They all, as a result of political and in this case, even technical compromises. So the treaty is what it is. One can look back 20 years later. I, for one, have criticized the entry into force clause many times. I was there. So there was no other option at the time. So, you know, one can do that, but at the end you need to look at what the treaty aims to do. And if that aim is to ban explosive testing forever, then the compromise to get states to even, not even sign on to treaty, to agree that there should be a treaty, was to allow them to ensure the reliability. And I think these are the important two words, reliability and safety.
Safety.
Not to ensure advancement of the technology, but the reliability and safety of their nuclear arsenals. I, for one, too, I'm very much critical of this in my private capacity. But I'm fully aware that the United States, Russia, UK, France, and I would say even China would not have agreed to negotiate the treaty had that not been the case. So it was a bit of a compromise, maybe a critical compromise, but it is what it is.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if Karen doesn't have another question, I have one more question. So you mentioned the UN Security Council Resolution 2310 that was adopted this year's September. So if I understand correctly, President Obama was trying to bypass congressional maneuver but of course it's a different things. But since given the fact that after 20 years of this opening for the signature, the treaty has not entered into force. Do you see any, I know this is not a good question for you or for me, but do you see any possibility that there is any other mechanism to completely ban nuclear testing, like to replace the CTBT?
Very, very good and very timely question, Masako. First of all, I think I should just slightly correct you that President Obama this was something that he himself, I'm told, was strongly in favor of. One can speculate why. Of course, the issue of legacy comes up. If you think about US presidents over time, there are, gosh, half a dozen I would can think of that in one way or the other was linked to a test ban treaty in one form or the other. President Obama had it within reach to make this part of his legacy. The famous Prague speech of 2009 contained very, very clear language that inspired all of us. By the way, it inspired me to go to Vienna instead of continuing living in Monterey. Where he called for that the United States will immediately and aggressively pursue the ratification of the treaty. Now we understand all the domestic difficulties that went along with that, etc. The fact is, it didn't happen. I don't agree, and it has been stated by several senior US officials, including, I think the President, but definitely the Secretary of State, that the Security Council resolution was aimed to bypass the Senate and the Constitution of the United States, because constitutionally, only the Senate can give it consent with 64 votes. But what it did, however, is put the treaty in the center of the world stage, right? So, yes, ministerial meetings, the General Assembly adopts, the First Committee has a little resolution amongst, 80 other resolutions on the CTBT. Now suddenly, the Security Council was tasked with doing this. But this picture shows an important thing. The Security Council is a show and tell, right? your country, if you vote, you have to put your hand up. Vote for, vote against, vote abstain. And I think what's important there is that, first of all, the 5 nuclear weapon states, including the United States and China, that have not ratified, publicly, on the world's most important stage, acknowledge that they themselves urge all states that have either not signed or ratified the treaty to do so without further delay. That's good. But also importantly, one state abstained, Egypt, right? So now one must ask yourself, what is the problem there? Who is the one who's holding? Is Israel the one who's holding things back? Is Iran holding back? You know, one must now ask the Egyptians, why are you holding things back here? Why? Egypt has no desire to develop nuclear weapons. They have policies linked to Israel, etc., etc. But this is a show and tell. It also, I think, given the media attention that came with it, you know, put attention to it. I must say also, but from an international law perspective, I would say it creates a bit of a problem, because CTBT enforcement and CTBT adherence is a national decision. Right? Any state has its own sovereign right to decide in terms of its own security or other conditions to sign up to a treaty. It was not adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which means that if it had been under Chapter 7, that if a state does not comply with this, it can be a target of UN Security Council action, including sanctions. So it's not Chapter 7. So you can argue, well, then it's not binding. So the answer that the Obama administration gave to the senators who were critical of this is that it will not be a Chapter 7 resolution. So it's not binding. But then you must ask yourself, if the Security Council, who is the most powerful body in international law, takes any decision, the Security Council, in terms of the Charter, is mandated to protect international peace and security. And it's very interesting also to note that the 15 members of the Council are not representing the countries, they don't represent their regions, they represent the entire body of the United Nations. That's how the Charter is written. So if that is the case, then any pronouncement by the Security Council must have some legal or at least moral weight, right? So, this puts into question a little bit, okay, if the Security Council says all these things and if it doesn't happen, what's the credibility of the Council on other things, right? For one, I think, there are some risks, but I think it was all in all a important element. I had my own views that had Secretary of State Clinton won the election, that this resolution would have featured very high on her administration's attempts to get the Senate to give its consent. I have no idea how this will play out in the future. But what I am pleased about is that a country such as China voted in favor. It didn't abstain. It didn't make any statement. It voted in favor of it. And I think that is important. The Russians voted in favor, thereby, again, reinforcing their commitment not to test.
Wait, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think I don't have any more questions. So, and this was really informative and important lecture. So thank you very much, John. And
You're most welcome.
Thank you. And the teachers and the students, thank you very much for watching these videos. And if you have any questions, please contact me and I will consult with Mr. John duPreez. So anyway, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.